His very existence was an impossibility, an anachronism. Looking at it from a scientific point of view, Tomy shouldn't have existed at all. And yet he had been there, utterly real, and with a human body, regardless of what science had to say about it. At any rate, Tomy was here and lived among us for several weeks, and that was enough time for him to get to know plenty of people, both good and bad. God knows I wasn't the only one that knew Tomy, though I have to say that only a handful of people knew what I knew, and those who didn't belong to this inner circle really had no idea who Tomy actually was. Sometimes in secluded moments, holding a glass of red wine up in front of my eyes, I was overcome by a great fear that I had dreamt the whole episode with Tomy. But Tomy wasn't a ghost. At home, absolutely everything reminded me of him: his room, the furniture, even the knives and forks. When signals like that are flying at you from every direction, you can't really escape your past. So I tried to find an excuse, and painfully realized that Tomy would have reprimanded me for my lying. As a result, as I said to Mario, the barman at the Surreal House Hotel, I had suddenly felt that a change of air would do me good. And the air in St. Moritz seemed the best air of all. "A wise decision," said Mario, and started telling me about various incidents that he had experienced during his 30 years at the Surreal House Hotel. As I listened to Mario's accounts, I honestly felt my breath catch in my throat. Seeing as most of the guests at this time of the evening were still chatting away in the dining room, I invited Mario to join me in a bottle of champagne. He declined, as he had only just started his shift. 3 hours later, still propped on my stool and staring bleary-eyed through the array of bottles lining the mirrored wall behind the bar, I thought I saw the examining magistrate from Solothurn coming towards me. "Send that man away," I commanded Mario. But he couldn't see anyone, and his assistant, too, assured me that no one was there. It's now around 11 o'clock in the morning, and the young ice princesses are turning pirouettes on the ice rink down below. I'm totally embarrassed that I threw my glass at the mirrored wall last night. I apologized profusely to Mario, and generously recompensed him for the damage. At least that grinning face had disappeared after my clattering throw. Later on, I will go and apologize to the hotel director and say to him that I cannot explain my wild outburst and that it must be due to overwork. And in the very moment that I am concocting up my excuse for my poor behavior, I feel the touch of breath behind me that I had felt so often during those weeks when Tomy had stared over my shoulder while I was working at my desk. I can hear him gently mocking me. "Erich, that lie is totally unnecessary." Great! But what are you supposed to do when you can't tell the truth because it's too unbelievable? The hotel director didn't hold my excessive behavior against me, although he let me know, in his extremely distinguished manner, that repeating the event would be severely frowned upon. I took his hand and promised him he had nothing to worry about. And I didn't feel that I was lying. In the meantime, a few rays of sunshine have begun to poke through the clouds. I'm sitting with a strong cup of black tea in front of me, trying to come to grips with myself and my situation. It's exactly 2 days since the examining magistrate from Solothurn revealed that, for the time being, he would not be needing any more statements from me. For the time being. With these people you never know what's coming later. They had questioned me for days, the experts, the forensic specialists, the detectives, and, of course, the dogged examining magistrate. Keller Hans, he was called. Killer Hans, more like. They had wanted to know every single tiny detail about what had happened, and, with hindsight, I should be happy that they didn't take me into custody. I told the truth, in every single interview. Nobody believed a word. Not even after Mark, who had been there from the very beginning, had corroborated every single word in separate interrogation, and not even after my wife, Elisabeth, had also confirmed every one of my statements. Even the gentlemen who were grilling me could understand my frustration, and I could understand the questioners too, because what I had experienced was utterly impossible. A man materializes out of thin air and then, just as suddenly, disappears after spending several weeks living at my side. And everyone had seen him, talked to him, and asked him questions. Who was going to buy that, even though it was the truth? Pure and simple. The experts had been the worst. They had torn me apart on a daily basis, and I had experienced some really bizarre moments. Everyone believed everyone, and no one believed anyone. What good were articles of clothing, shoes, a watch, and underwear? What good were fingerprints when their owner hadn't even been good enough to leave a body behind? A body, by the way, that, even if it had existed, was not of this earth, and yet nevertheless was a human being. A body that had no birth certificate, no baptism certificate, no scholastic records, and no earthly past whatsoever, aside from the weeks that he had spent among us. At any rate, they had confiscated a letter from Tomy, scribbled down in blue ballpoint in his handwriting that looked so infuriatingly similar to my own, which made the whole thing even more complicated. This letter, written to my housekeeper Edith, had provided the police with Tomy's fingerprints. But, impossibly, Tomy had exactly the same fingerprints as me, something that had never been seen anywhere in the world. Everyone has his own unique fingerprints, except for Tomy and me. The examining magistrate had held the fingerprints up under my nose, Tomy's and mine. They were identical. "So you are the corpse!" he screamed at me, and I shouted back, just as loud, "But you can see that I'm standing in front of you. Alive, for God's sake! I've explained to you 1,000 times how Tomy came into being, and his fingerprints are the proof. He was a copy of me. Have you never heard of clones?" The examining magistrate just laughed at that and said spitefully that I didn't need to come up with such nonsense. Human cloning was impossible, not to mention the fact that there had not been nearly enough time. Then he held up Tomy's passport. It was a replacement passport, issued by the Swiss embassy in Tehran. "And this?" he asked impatiently. "Is this some kind of ghost? A Swiss passport made out for an Erich von Daniken, born April 24th, 1957, 169 centimeters tall, brown eyes, brown hair, and distinguishing features, a mole on the back of the left hand. Although no Erich von Daniken was ever born in Zofingen on April 24th, 1957. Do you take us for idiots?" They would eventually figure what was rotten in the state of Denmark. Moreover, he slyly pointed out, waving his finger threateningly towards me, that if Tomy and I were so identical, and now one of us was missing, then I could just as easily be the copy, and it was the real Erich von Daniken who had been murdered. "Prove to me," he demanded, slamming his fist into the table, "that you are the original." "But you already know from my wife, from Mark and all the other witnesses, that Tomy was 30 years younger than me." I moaned back at him. "I'm 52 years old. Or do I look to you like a 22-year-old? In the light of all these improbable events, I had spontaneously decided to leave Solothurn and come here. I knew the Suffretta House Hotel in St. Moritz from earlier visits. I had called the examining magistrate beforehand and put him in the picture regarding my new whereabouts. Public prosecutors and Swiss examining magistrates are no different. You never knew when they might change their minds and lead them to issue a warrant for your arrest. I was only allowed to go on condition that I called Solothurn once a day. If I didn't call, for whatever reason, the authorities would assume that I was attempting to flee justice. It was now, while drinking my 3rd cup of Darjeeling tea, that I came up with my plan to write down the events of the previous few weeks. No, not for the benefit of others, but rather so that I could get straight in my own head what had really happened. True, I had, now and again, taken a close look at myself to see if I had been suffering from hallucinations, to see if I had duped Mark, my wife, and all the others who knew Tomy. Whenever I needed reassurance, I called Mark, or one of the others involved, and asked them to recount certain situations to me, just using key words. But my memory of the events always proved to be perfect. Everyone else's experiences with Tomy were exactly the same as mine. I wrote down these key words until late in the night. At around 2 in the morning, I called Mark, dragging him out of sleep, and asked him what Tomy's first words had been. I had written down the words as I remembered them before I had dialed. Mark pleaded for a moment to get his head together. Then he slowly quoted Tomy's first words. They had obviously left a pretty strong impression in his memory, too, because what he now said matched what I had written exactly, word for word. "You don't really want to shoot yourself, do you?" had been the first thing that we had heard from Tomy's lips. I thanked Mark profusely, but warned him that he could look forward to further calls, but for the rest of that night, I let him have his peace. I have a wonderful view of the Korvatsch, the famous mountain just south of St. Moritz. The sky is now the kind of blue that you can only see in Engadine. My thoughts are suddenly captivated by the rocky cliffs and glaciers. They lose themselves somewhere where only thoughts can go. If only the piece of paper covered in my scribbled notes wasn't lying there on the table. Suddenly my idea to write everything down seems futile. Who would ever believe any of it anyway? I'm not related to Mark in any way, by the way. He was my secretary back then, and is my friend now. And during that dangerous trip through the highlands of Pakistan, he had also proved to be an extremely reliable partner. He is much younger than me, and of course I felt responsible for him because I had persuaded him to take this trip. For him, if no one else, I would write down that bizarre sequence of events so that he, too, could finally be rid of his nightmares. Mark hasn't slept properly since the day he met Tomy. His mother recently told me that Mark had cried out during the night. What he had said she hadn't been able to understand, but she had found him sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat. When I hear stories like that, I ask myself if we had ever really had a chance to free ourselves of Tomy. It's true, he was a man like us, of flesh and blood, even if he did appear under highly mysterious circumstances. And then he disappeared under even more mysterious circumstances. Of course, we could never have just left him there defenseless and alone in the cold early dawn, especially with the knowledge that the rising sun would bring with it temperatures that would mean an agonizing death for anyone left alone in the desert. And because we didn't leave him there, we ended up living through an adventure that, in the end, left us looking like murderers. Mark and I know that we're not murderers, and my wife knows it too, but we suspect that none of the officers investigating the case are quite so convinced of our innocence. If they were, we might have been able to carry out the perfect murder. What I now write, from my memory, the notes of the previous night, and several phone conversations with Mark, is basically the story that the examining magistrate Kellerhans already knows. Mark and I had to make countless statements to the effect, but the difference between all those civil servants and us is that, although they didn't believe a word of what we said, we know with absolute certainty that is exactly how it was. The daybreak when Tomy came into being. Quetta, Pakistan, a city of 200,000 souls at the crossing point of the roads from Kandahar in Afghanistan, Zaidan in Iran, and Multan and Sukkur in Pakistan, where we had just come from. This ancient Mughal city is now industrialized and relatively clean, and even has a halfway decent hotel, which, bizarrely enough, is called Lourdes, after the city in France where the Virgin Mary appeared to a young girl. Despite the hotel's Christian-sounding name, which seemed so out of place in a city of Muslims, I had seen no sign of God. Otherwise, I might have stayed a bit longer in Quetta. The blue plaster that covered the 2-story hotel building was peeling off in several places, revealing an older clay wall, strengthened with straw and, here and there, the odd stone. The room that Mark and I were sharing had a stuffy smell of old turpentine and insecticide. On the ceiling, a decrepit fan turned lazily, as if it had been slowly poisoned by years of exposure to so many pesticides. We had arrived the previous afternoon, following a roundabout journey from Multan. It was a roundabout journey because the Indus had again broken free of its banks and all the usual routes to Quetta had either been blocked or simply washed away. Our next port of call was to be the Iranian border town of Zahedan, which was 721 kilometers distant from Quetta, across the Baluchistan desert. Baluchistan, which contains the districts of Quetta and historic Kalat, covers an area of nearly 350,000 square kilometers and, at that time, was home to approximately 4 million people. Of these, a considerable amount are nomads who regularly wander across the borders to Iran and Afghanistan with their herds of sheep. There are strong political groups here who would like to see the region win its independence from Pakistan. These ambitions are given emphasis by the many bandits who break out from their mountain hideouts to attack military convoys or to rob travelers. We had been warned not to travel across this part of Baluchistan without a military escort. The previous evening we had been told we should make contact with the brigadier of Quetta district responsible for such matters, and, after some telephoning around, we eventually organized a meeting with him before dinner in his office in the military headquarters. "How many people are in your party? Which vehicles will you be using? What color is it? Have you got any weapons? Do you have a radio?" He wanted to know the answers to these and many more questions, and early this morning he had called us at the Hotel Lourdes, saying, "You can travel without an escort. We have the route under control. All of our posts have been informed about your beige Range Rover. Stay in your vehicle if people in plain clothes attempt to stop you. If worst comes to worst, just put your foot down and drive away as quickly as possible behind the nearest rock outcropping, and then zigzag your way out of there. Make sure you raise plenty of dust. That'll mean they won't be able to see you. Your car is much quicker than the clapped-out old vehicles they'll be driving anyway. Good luck." The night before, Mark and I had been up till 10 o'clock packing the car. Boxes filled with 2-liter bottles of mineral water, a spare jerry can of petrol, an additional 100 liters of water in 4 large canisters, and a plastic bottle of distilled water for the batteries in case they dried out. On top of this we placed the toolbox, spare wheels, maps, and compass, taking care not to forget the pistol and tear gas spray, hidden away but easy to get to. And of course we packed the camera cases and so on. After we'd finished our work, the hotel owner kindly let us use his kitchen to cook up some spaghetti and tomato sauce. We served it up with a bottle of red wine, which was light enough that we wouldn't have too much trouble getting up the next morning. At 6:30 a.m. we were ready to set off. The concierge of the Lourdes, a refined old Englishman who'd been in the country for years, slammed the rear doors of the car shut and then stood there and waved, shouting out, "Good luck!" I started up the motor and scoffed. "Well, Mark, let's be going then. May St. Christopher watch over us." "I don't know him. What does he do then?" asked Mark. "Heavens above, lad, where were you when you were supposed to be in religious instruction? St. Christopher is one of the 14 holy helpers. He is the patron saint of sailors and wagoners, and, hopefully, of people crossing deserts." Mark crossed himself rather clumsily, as he's not even Catholic. "May St. Christopher forgive me." But the saint must have been put out by Mark's ignorance, as events were about to show. After only half an hour on the road, we were already in the mountains. Not mountains like I know them from Switzerland, however. Here there were no plants or snow, no green blades of grass or mountain streams, only the railway track which runs from Sukur to Zahedan. We saw 3 stations, but not a single train. Every half hour we were stopped by military patrols. Officers checked out our passports and after a few minutes' palaver allowed us to continue on our way with an ironic, "Good luck." For about 60 kilometers, our route was accompanied by a telephone cable running along at ground level next to the road. It was comforting to know that we were somehow still connected to civilization. We were making good progress, and by midday we had already covered a third of our journey when we were suddenly confronted by a roadblock, constructed from large blocks of stone, which had been laid haphazardly across the road. Behind them stood one man in uniform, accompanied by 4 others in civilian clothing, their machine pistols casually pointed at the floor. The uniformed man ordered me to get out of the car, which was exactly what the brigadier had warned me not to do. Why were the other men not in uniforms? Were they no longer part of the Pakistani army? The uniformed man pointed at the metal cases on the rear seat of the car. I knew that there were ignorant people around who liked opening up technical equipment or pulling out the contents of exposed film rolls, only then to exclaim that the films have nothing on them. My aluminum cases housed metal detectors, which were sensitive instruments easily damaged by careless handling. Suddenly, I had a bright idea. I smiled my best smile and reached deliberately with my right hand for the console in the middle of the car. My Polaroid camera was lying there. I slowly pointed it at Mark and pressed the button. Then I aimed the lens at the uniformed man and smiled even more sweetly than before. Right after I pressed the button, the Polaroid picture whirred out of the camera's slit. Still smiling in an affable manner, I tore off the protective strip from the picture and waved it around, fanning myself in the process. When the uniformed man saw his own likeness appearing in full color about a minute later, he must have thought I was some kind of magician. The turban-wearing civilians laid the machine pistols on the floor and gawped over their boss's shoulder. Then they all wanted just such a picture for themselves, and then finally a group picture with me. Mark shot the family portrait from the car window and passed me the camera. I asked him to hand me a new packet of film. It was the last Polaroid film we had. Laughing, I asked the 5 men to sit on the stones blocking the road and took 2 more pictures. After this display of magic, I began to heave one of the stones off the road and gestured to the men to help me with the others. After I gave the camera to the officer and showed him how to press the button, the others joined in with my stone-clearing activities. I got back behind the wheel and we waved and laughed, and then I put my foot down. It was the last checkpoint we came across, and to this day I don't know whether it was a genuine one or not, or how long it had taken those roadblockers to realize that after the film had run out, there would be no more magic pictures sliding out of the camera slit. The mountains lay behind us, and ahead of us stretched the endless desert, initially flanked on the right by the foothills, which gradually faded away as we drove on. The road became more of a dirt track, the surface transforming into a kind of corrugated strip with furrows spaced around 15 to 20 centimeters apart. Initially, I tried driving slowly over them, but the Range Rover clattered, shook, and vibrated unbearably. Finally, I figured out that a driving speed of about 60 to 70 kilometers per hour was ideal. The only danger at that speed was where sudden sand drifts covered the bumpy road. If the wheels were caught at an angle in the sand, the car would skid around in an instant, like on black ice, but without ice's advantages, that you could see it and that it stopped at the edge of the road. Here, on the other hand, lurked quicksand where the whole vehicle could sink into the sand without leaving a trace. Sitting behind the wheel, I felt like one of those bulky men operating a jackhammer. Every bump was transmitted along my arms to my elbows. How long would the car hold out? The gray-beige color of the Range Rover was slowly being completely blanked out by white sand dust. How long would the air filter cope with that? When would the spark plugs and the distributor give up the ghost? Please, holy St. Christopher, anything but a breakdown in this awful heat. The external temperature was now at about 50 degrees Celsius. I couldn't lean my elbows out of the open window anymore, because the metal of the doors was now hot enough to fry bacon. At around 4 in the afternoon, we saw a few more houses in the middle of this forsaken desert. I drove up towards them until we could see a signboard bearing the legend, Customs. What was all that about? A customs post here in the middle of the desert? A lonely old soldier in a dark brown t-shirt explained that this was the last Pakistani settlement 200 kilometers before the Iranian border. He demanded $20 in small bills, which I paid, and then asked what the people here actually did. "Nothing," he said. "We're just here to keep an eye on the border." The name of this desert backwater was Nok Kundi. We had just driven across purgatory, and now we were driving directly into hell itself. The desert track became even more irregular. The gaps between the furrows in the road were randomly spaced, and the sudden sand drifts more frequent. There may have been no water here as far as the eye could see, but at least once a year it must rain cats and dogs, because every once in a while the track simply disappeared, as if washed away. It wasn't possible to manage much more than jogging tempo, no more than 20 kilometers per hour. In the rearview mirror I could see our endless dust trail rising up into the twilight, fanning out behind us like a pale gray veil. 7 p.m. The heat was still oppressive. Position: still 126 kilometers to the Iranian border in the desert of Baluchistan. Throughout the whole day we had not seen a single vehicle apart from ourselves on the road. Mark's face was swollen, his eyes rimmed with red. Sweat was pouring out of every pore, but despite the heat he was shivering. It was clear that he had some kind of fever. He coughed and wheezed like someone with some kind of lung disease. I vaguely recalled something about dust allergies, so I moistened a cloth with mineral water and wrapped it around his mouth and nose. I drove on with Mark sitting next to me, wrapped up like a mummy, occasionally gasping and coughing. But it was hard work. 1 kilometer after the next, the massive blazing gold disk of the sun sank slowly down behind a massive sand dune, and suddenly the heat relented. Our position was now 98 kilometers from the Iranian border. Mark's condition still had me worried, however. We decided to call it a day. We would spend the night here and give Mark's cells a bit of a chance to regenerate. It would have been foolish to try to carry on anyway. The sand drifts don't show up well in the headlights. This was the incredible night when Tomy came into being. Mark and I will never be able to forget the events of that night. It all began with Mark's chattering teeth and 39-degree fever. He got himself some medication to reduce fever and some antihistamines from our onboard first aid kit and washed them down with generous amounts of mineral water. To give him enough room to lie down properly across the front seats of the car, I made myself a bed on the roof, the rear seats being packed full with our equipment. Occasionally a cool desert breeze wafted through the night, blowing fine dust into my eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, penetrating the warmth of my woolen blanket. I looked up at the starry skies above me the way they only appear in the middle of a desert. Clearer and brighter than any planetarium. Those strange heavenly bodies seemed so close that I could simply reach out and grab them. Despite being numb with fatigue, I stayed awake. Below me, Mark still coughed. Every movement he made was amplified by the car's suspension across the chassis. Sometime after midnight, I finally dozed off, but woke again around an hour later, shivering with the cold. I stared at the glittering jewels of the night sky and began to daydream. Somewhere out there, in the endless expanse of space, spaceships would be zooming around from planet to planet, bringing post and strange wares from bizarre worlds to distant outposts of the Milky Way. Perhaps there would even be wars between planets or solar systems. Maybe even now information was flashing between the constellation of Pleiades and the planets of Polaris, our North Star. We human beings, we microscopic mites down below, don't have the slightest inkling of it all. Never had I seen the constellation of Lyra so clearly as in this night. I knew that its main star, Vega, was 50 times brighter than our sun, but on this night, for the very first time, I could clearly make out its blue coloration with the naked eye. I wondered how many planets might be in orbit around Vega. I recalled that Lyra was famous for its double-double star, an absolute rarity in our galaxy. Astronomers believe that the possibility of life in a double-star system is very slight, if not non-existent, as the constant radiation from the binary suns would make the emergence of life impossible. But what makes them so sure about it? Maybe life forms have evolved under quite different conditions than we can imagine. Maybe there are solar systems with binary stars populated by gaseous intelligent beings. Maybe they don't even need spaceships to travel the unimaginable distances between the stars. Maybe there is so much that is so completely different to what we assume. I would give my life to be able to fly out into the universe, past the glowing suns, violet planets, and, why not, life forms that look like giant spiders. Although I cannot for the life of me stand the creatures normally. I felt like a microbe stranded on a crumb of bread, and although I was free to hop around the place as much as I liked, I would never make it out of the bakery. I had heard plenty of UFO stories, but I had never seen a UFO myself. However, tonight, this was what my heart was yearning for. I stared at Vega with its blue rays and really began to wish that some being from out there in space would come and visit me. "Come down here. I want to talk to you," I thought. "Show yourselves, if you're out there." Suddenly, I recalled the Volga song from the operetta The Tsarevich and began quietly humming to myself. A soldier stands on the Volga's banks, standing guarding his fatherland. And then the refrain, "Have you up there forgotten me too? My heart is yearning for love so true. So many angels in heaven abide by thee. Send just one of them down here to me." All kinds of crazy thoughts occurred to me then. "Halloo, you strangers," I giggled to myself. "Show yourselves if you're really there." At some stage I must have nodded off to sleep again, for I was suddenly awakened by a flash like lightning. I started, as if a bomb had gone off under me. All around, as far as the eye could see, there was no sign of a storm. Then I suddenly had a feeling as if heat were spreading out under the surface of my skull, and the moisture between the folds of my gray matter was beginning to bubble and boil. I pressed my hands desperately to my temples and began to shake my head frantically. It seemed to help. The pressure slowly eased. With dawning horror, I recalled reading something about strokes. Had I just had a stroke? Was I going to be partially paralyzed, never be able to speak again? I opened my eyes and saw a dark red band across the horizon, the morning twilight. A second later I heard a shot ring out under me. It sounded like a dry plop, and Mark started to cry out. The Range Rover started to vibrate violently. I leapt down from the roof and yanked open the driver's door. Had Mark somehow gotten hold of the gun and fired it under his blanket? Was he suffering some kind of delirium, no longer knowing what he was doing? If only I had taken the pistol with me up onto the roof. "Mark, what are you doing? Wake up! Give me the gun!" I screamed at him, realizing at the same time that my fears about walking and talking were unfounded. As I had opened the door, the light had automatically come on. Mark stared out at me wide-eyed and said in a shaky voice, "I didn't shoot Eric. The banging is coming from somewhere here in the car." I went to the rear of the car and fumbled nervously with the lock to the rear door. I swung it upwards and immediately noticed that the window was shattered. I didn't even have time to come up with a theory as to how it could have broken, as there was another loud bang, and then a torrent of water, almost like from out of a shower head, hit me right in the face. God damn! I shook my head and went to dry my face on my right sleeve, but my face was completely dry. Not a drop of water. Simply nothing. "Erich!" Mark was clearly having trouble speaking. "Look over there." He was pointing at something on the ground, about 3 meters away from the left-hand side of the car. There was another bang, and I watched as one of the 2-liter water bottles exploded inside the car. The water didn't flood out. It didn't create a puddle, but instead, before my very eyes, formed itself into a water funnel, swirling around itself above the exact same spot that Mark was anxiously staring at. It was as if some hidden underground vacuum cleaner was trying to suck it up. "Mark, get out of the car!" I screamed, without even really realizing why I said it. Mark grabbed onto the steering wheel, swung his legs and made his way toward the front of the vehicle. It struck me that he had bare feet, and I was thinking to myself, I hope he doesn't tread on a scorpion, when the next bang cracked through the night, immediately followed by another. I ran away from the car to what seemed a safe distance, about 5 meters. Mark ran over to me and we stared goggle-eyed at the events that were playing out before our very eyes above the desert sand. The water from the exploded bottles was swirling through the air to that eerie spot where it coalesced into a floating water funnel. Suddenly there were 3 more explosions, and the water that was released formed another funnel, which then combined with the first floating funnel. A fine mist of water vapor formed and the sand started to move. At first I thought of one of the larger scorpions digging itself out of the sand, and then some kind of worm. Then it looked more like a small, constantly twitching snake, growing rapidly. The snake seemed to split into several, then laced themselves together, a fourth of them forming a kind of translucent head with 2 large eyes. We heard another bang. By now around 10 of the 2-liter bottles must have exploded, and a bent body grew out of the head in front of us. "It looks like an embryo," said Mark in awe, and I could see that he was right, although my common sense was telling me that I shouldn't believe the evidence of my own eyes. One explosion followed the next inside the car, until every single one of the water bottles, it must have been 54 liters of water in all, had burst, and the embryo in the desert sand had slowly bubbled and steamed. Part of the paint on the car's bodywork started to melt, and for a moment I thought I could smell magnesium. I knew the smell from my school days because we had always rubbed magnesium powder on our hands before doing gymnastics on the horizontal bars. Then there was suddenly a smell of gasoline in the air. The next thing we heard was some kind of sucking noise, which became a roaring and then a bubbling sound. As if thrown by a ghostly hand, one of our spanners flew through the shattered rear window, not floating slowly, but at a speed that would have done serious damage to our skulls if we had had the misfortune to be in the way. The water funnel over the sand had disappeared. Where it had been a moment before, the spanner now floated, and I don't know how else I could describe it, seemed to be melting in certain places. Mark and I were horrified. This was definitely no kind of earthly phenomenon. We were witnesses to something uncanny. Coincidentally, I had written a book some years before about unexplained apparitions, and so I was aware of various different types and forms of appearances from the literature. Now, as I stared dumbfounded at that spot in the sand where the body was forming, I was struck by the similarities to the statements of the Lourdes and Fatima children. Their visions were always heralded by lightning and then followed by electrical discharges, which in turn were associated with rushing, crackling sounds. One of the Fatima children, little Lucia, had stated that before every single appearance she had noticed a noise like a firework rocket exploding in the distance. All this occurred to me while I, incapable of uttering a single sound, was staring at the apparition slowly taking shape in front of me. Mark wheezed next to me. "In the name of God, what is it?" "It must be some kind of vision. You know, like those ones in Fatima in Portugal. Some kind of strange energy form is materializing here. I remember the statements made by the Fatima children in the transcripts. They said that at first they had seen something that looked like a sack of flour shrouded in a floating veil. I don't think we have too much to fear. That thing will disappear into thin air in a second. I sounded a lot braver than I actually felt, but I wanted to reassure Mark. My insides, however, were in complete chaos. I was really scared. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure Mark could hear it, and the veins on my temples felt as though they were about to burst. Then I unexpectedly had the feeling that I wasn't alone in my skull. As if I was suddenly schizophrenic. As if all my higher functions were being switched off against my will. Incomprehensibly quickly, I was overcome by a feeling of leaden tiredness. My knees sagged, and I fell to the ground. The whole thing must have lasted only a few seconds, since Mark grabbed me and cried, "Come on! We've got to get out of here!" While I was pulling myself together, a young boy was growing at an alarming pace out of the desert sand in front of us. The boy became a youth with hair on his head and in the pubic regions. Then there was silence. Mark and I watched as his chest began to rise and then sink. He breathed deeply and, as it seemed to me, very slowly. His eyes were closed, his hair and body covered in sand. Then the unfathomable creature balled his hands into fists, moved his fingers, his toes, pulled his knees in.